Mr. Spire, thank you so much for joining the Quillette podcast.
Thank you for inviting me, Jonathan.
Now, obviously, this is a story with moving parts. Just as I was arranging the technical details of this interview, I saw a news report that Iran is accusing Israel of bombing its state TV facilities. This seems to be like the kind of thing you see in an all-out war. Did you anticipate this level of intensity of regional conflict?
First of all, I think that we are in an all-out war. So it's not just that it looks like an all-out war, it's that we're in an all-out war. And maybe it's important for us to begin to get our heads around that. I mean, none of us know where this is heading. It could, of course, be brought to a close within a week or two, or it could, which is very conceivable, or it could go on for a lot longer. But what's going on is state-to-state war. And I think it's important, or maybe even crucially important, for us to acknowledge that, because it is something in a certain way new. For those of us who've been, as we both have, looking at the Middle East for quite a few years now, or maybe even deeply involved with it, we're very used to the idea of wars between states against paramilitary organizations. We're even used to the notion of war between states and paramilitary organizations which are proxies of other states. But the notion of state-to-state warfare in our Middle East is something that we haven't really seen for a while. Certainly with regard to Israel, very interesting to note, this is the first time that Israel has been engaged in a clear war against another state for a generation, actually, since, of course, there was clashes between Israel and Syria in 1982, but really you have to go back, decades to get to a point of state-to-state warfare. We are now in a state-to-state conflict. Israelis are just getting used to that because they're getting used to the kind of ordnance that is being thrown at them now, way beyond the capacity of a paramilitary organization. The Iranians are getting used to it too. Now, it's a strange state-to-state war because it's one, and I'm sure we'll discuss this further along, which has no ground component, and which very probably will have no ground component for reasons that we can discuss. But nevertheless, this is state-to-state warfare, and we should acknowledge that and be thinking of it in those terms.
The standard narrative of, I guess, the last half century of warfare between Israel and its neighbors was that the Arab countries tried to attack Israel through conventional land-based armies. The last real kick at the can was 1973 Yom Kippur War, and that was a failed strategy. And so certainly beginning with Hezbollah in the 1980s, the idea was that the correct way to attack Israel was through asymmetric methods. It was through paramilitary, terrorist, missile attacks, some combination thereof. And Hezbollah was supposed to be the very model of that. A sort of de facto land-based army. It's the subnational, but not that subnational force that would engage Israel, both with missiles and perhaps even with something resembling an invading army, or at least invading terrorists, in accompaniment to Iranian missiles and such. But one of the very strange parts about this is that Hezbollah, and I guess to a lesser extent and more recently, the Houthis in Yemen, some might even lump Hamas in there, Iran has been cultivating these assets for maybe two generations. I mean, certainly since 1982 with Hezbollah. Now is the moment of truth. Now is when this kind of shadow army was supposed to mobilize. And this was kind of a nightmare scenario. I mean, Western journalists talked about this in very apocalyptic terms, that Israel would be facing death from above, but also death by 1,000 cuts from all these paramilitary groups. Am I to understand correctly that Hezbollah, more or less, when this conflict broke out, Hezbollah kind of said, for the last 4 decades, our very raison d'etre was to get involved in a conflict like this. But now that it's happening, it's not for us. Like, is that kind of what's happened?
Yeah, it is. Let me first of all say that with regard to this notion of turning from conventional warfare to asymmetrical warfare, it is, of course, the case that the greater number of significant states that engaged in state-to-state warfare against Israel did not then turn to an asymmetrical strategy. They turned to making peace with Israel. And it's worth making that point. I say Egypt and Jordan did not use asymmetrical warfare. They tried conventional warfare, failed, and made peace, which is kind of the thing that's supposed to happen, right? it hasn't happened in all cases with us, but it has happened with, in a way, the most important country, which is Egypt, and the country with which Israel has the longest border, which is Jordan. So for the most part, that is what happened. Yes, asymmetrical warfare was adopted by the Palestinian national movement initially, and then it was with the use of, and Syria also had its own sort of paramilitary proxies. But then you're absolutely right. Asymmetrical warfare has come into its own as a truly potent tool against Israel.
And drones. I should have mentioned drones.
Drones we'll get to, but I mean,
yeah.
asymmetrical warfare in the ground already from before, when drones became significant, was adopted as a truly potent tool as a result of the strategy of Islamic Republic of Iran. And you're absolutely correct that all the way back to 1982 with Lebanese Hezbollah, the Iranians have been at this for quite some time. I mean, I should add as a caveat that Israel faced a very significant asymmetrical war, which was not, at least entirely, in the hands of Iran-supported proxies, which, of course, was the thing that is misnamed the Second Intifada, the insurgency between 2000 and 2004. But even there, you have to caveat the caveat, because the Iranians nevertheless were kind of there in spirit, in the sense that the Second Intifada was absolutely inspired by and would not have taken place without Hezbollah's successful insurgency against Israel between 1985 and 2000, which resulted in the unilateral withdrawal of the IDF, of course, from Lebanon in May 2000. So even when the Iranians are not there, they're kind of there with this stuff. Yes, they are the state that have made asymmetrical warfare against Israel absolutely a strategic tool for the first time. And as you put it correctly, the notion was that because they knew they couldn't assemble armored divisions and artillery and
their air forces were outgunned.
Air force is absolutely, they have this archaic air force, a few MiG-29s and so on. What they decided to do was to adopt a threefold strategy: the nuclear program, of course, the ballistic missile array, and very significantly, the promotion of political/military organizations. I mean, organizations combining political and military capacity in neighboring countries and in countries surrounding Israel, with the intention of surrounding Israel, enveloping Israel with kind of semi-regular armies, not classic terrorist organizations, but hybrid forces, somewhere between a regular army and a paramilitary force. And Lebanese Hezbollah was the prototype or archetype, was the prototype and indeed became the archetype of a force of that kind. There's a number of other forces. Palestinian forces were drawn in and turned into something tended to resemble that, with Hamas being the obvious example. And yes, the idea was eventually, at the hour of need, these forces would be mobilized. And what I think we'll go on to discuss is the way in which Israel basically declined to play the part allotted to it, which was as this sort of hapless, helpless, deterred, weak society desperately seeking to avoid the final crushing blow. And Israel understood that was the role it had been allotted. Israel has declined to play that role, and hence we are currently at the state where we're at.
A lot of people were shocked by the success of the Israeli operation against Hezbollah, which was sort of the predecessor operation, essentially the organizational decapitation of Hezbollah through a combination of they blew up a Hezbollah meeting and killed Hassan Nasrallah.
Yeah.
At the same time, that kind of like bizarre, successful but also bizarre Jason Bourne plot with the blowing up their pagers, which was devastating. Would Israel's missile attacks against Iran have been a possibility, a strategic possibility, had Hezbollah's operations not been devastated last year by those twin attacks against the Hassan Nasrallah and his command structure?
Yeah, it's difficult for me to imagine that they would have been. And I think when we're looking at the achievement against Hezbollah in the last 3 months of 2024, we should also consider the third component, which was a successful limited ground maneuver north of the border, which took down the greater part of Hezbollah's infrastructure along the border. So you have these three components: the destruction of the leadership, which you mentioned, in terms of course, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, a number of his close associates, and his successor, the late Hisham Abu Safiaddin. So a whole bunch of leaders. Then the pages and the walkie-talkies, which take out the mid-level cadres, which remove about 3,000 of the mid-level cadres from the organization. And then the third, the ground maneuver.
Can you talk a little bit more about the ground operations in southern Lebanon? Because that actually received relatively scant coverage in the media.
First of all, there's still 5 positions that Israel maintains north of the border. In other words, Israel has maintained positions joining Israeli communities just south of the border. Israel's remained north of the border. Secondly, yeah, for a period of a couple of months, there was a ground maneuver going on, and it was intended to reduce and destroy Hezbollah's infrastructure along the border. And this was largely achieved, such that when we hear now about the Lebanese armed forces, dismantling Hezbollah infrastructure along the border, what the Lebanese armed forces are mainly doing is simply reoccupying positions that have already been destroyed by Israel.
Has the Lebanese government and military infrastructure been newly empowered by this? Because I read one news item about how Lebanon has warned Hezbollah not to get involved in this conflict.
Yeah.
The idea of the Lebanese government warning Hezbollah about anything would have been kind of otherworldly just a few years ago.
Yeah, this is all directly related to the weakening of Lebanese Hezbollah. It's simply a much, much weaker vessel than it was prior to the summer of 2024. It's received a mauling at the hands of Israel, and consequently that has emboldened the new Lebanese government, and specifically the new Lebanese President Joseph Aoun and the new Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, to take a more determined and assertive policy. Now, it's still nowhere near what is needed or what would be needed to truly deal with the problem of Hezbollah, but it's a great significant step in the right direction. And to a great extent, yeah, it's kind of it's an unstated gift from Israel to the government of Lebanon. Regarding ceasefire negotiations, yeah, it's really important. This is the crucial point. Just prior to his death, Hassan Nasrallah repeated the basic logic of Hezbollah's operations that began, of course, on October 8th, 2023, just at the start of the war, when he said, if Israel thinks we're going to conclude a separate ceasefire, separate from what's going on in Gaza, they can forget it. We'll carry on fighting until Hamas chooses to stop fighting in Gaza and a ceasefire is reached down there. Well, that was very clearly stated. He was killed a few days later. And then Hezbollah in November did exactly what he said it was not going to do. Basically, unilaterally chose to bow out of the fighting because of the damage that had been inflicted upon it.
It throws conventional wisdom on its head a little bit because, and not just conventional wisdom, I think there's empirical research for this, that foreign policy conducted from 15,000 feet up often is counterproductive. You just inflame populations, you get local populations rallying to the side of controversial or factional forces. There doesn't seem to have been that rallying around the flag effect, or to the extent it is, it's people who are maybe Lebanese nationalists who have taken the opportunity to reject Hezbollah's influence. Like that, it kind of flies against, in the face of what I might expect, which is that you bomb a population and they become more sympathetic to the targets of the bomb. Yeah, that doesn't seem to have happened in Lebanon.
I think, first of all, Hezbollah's loyalists, of course, are still very much loyal to it. But I think, secondly, the population wasn't really bombed. The point is that Israel's operations were very much pinpointed and targeted.
Well, there's a community within Beirut, as I understand, which is heavily Shiite, which did receive a lot of
in the Dakhia in South Beirut. Yeah, of course. But this is Hezbollah heartland. These are Hezbollah supporters living there. Sure, Israel doesn't have any quarter with regard to them. But there wasn't sort of carpet bombing of populations or any of this stuff. There was and I think what it shows you is, that military means, I'm going to put it, that the notion that has been beloved of, the Western radical left, and has then been sort of adopted by Islamists as well, that somehow, paramilitary organizations are undefeatable and that they just always win. So, no, this is simply nonsense. What I would want to say is that, in terms of looking at the bigger picture of this, the Hezbollah defeat is one component, but the reason why Iran now stands helpless in terms of ground capacity vis-a-vis Israel is not only because of Hezbollah. It's also because of the effective military removal of Hamas. And this is very important to understand as well. Yeah. Hamas is not yet politically defeated. Israel cannot declare victory. There's still a kind of low-level Hamas insurgency going on in Gaza. But the notion of Hamas performing the kind of threat that it might have been able to perform had we met now the Hamas of October 5th, 2023, is history. It's a largely destroyed organization.
I wanted to apologize to listeners. It seems we're talking about every country except Iran. That's my fault, because I think it's important to set the geopolitical stage for what's happening.
Absolutely.
But my next question was Syria, because Syria was kind of this flyover country between Lebanon and Iran, but essentially a kind of staging area and a logistical hub and an essential conduit for Iranian assistance to Hezbollah. How important was was that, which again, there's so much happening in the Middle East. People kind of forget, like the Assad regime toppling was itself a historic phenomenon.
What?
You know, it was this huge phenomenon, and it had enormous knock-on effects for Israel's strategic position. My understanding is that Israeli operations were going on within Syria's borders for months, and for all I know, Israeli agents are still in Syria at this point.
Well, first of all, the Israel Defense Forces are inside Syria all the way up to the Bravo line. I mean, that's not in the formerly demilitarized zone, and that's something which is open.
You'd think we'd hear more about that. Like
Yeah,
that.
I think yeah, absolutely, Jonathan. I think if we were in like normal times in the Middle East,
Right.
that would be a huge story, right? And instead, it's one which we hardly hear anything about because we are in such far from normal times. But yeah, the fall of Assad in Syria is absolutely a historic moment. Everyone talks about 50 years or 53 or 55 years of 54 years of Assad's rule. But let's remember that it's even a bit longer than that because the Assads came to power in the framework of the rule of the Ba'ath Party, the Arab Renaissance Party,
Yeah.
which has been in power in Syria was in power in Syria since 1963. So we're really talking about a massive period of time which ended in December 8th, 2024. It's a truly historic moment. And it is also absolutely a product of the stuff that we were talking about earlier. That's to say, it's about the fact that Israel had essentially decimated the Iran-led regional bloc, and in this case specifically, the proxies of the Iran-led regional bloc, and in this case specifically the Lebanese Hezbollah organization, is a massive contributory factor to the fall of Assad, because after all, we remember that both Lebanese Hezbollah and indeed the Iranians themselves, the IRGC itself, and of course the Iraqi Shia militias, the Hashd al-Sha'bi, were all crucial components in preventing Assad's fall during the height of the civil war. Let us remember that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the movement of now President Ahmed al-Shara, or Abu Muhammad al-Zolani, as everybody knew him prior to his coming to power, was only an organization of around 45,000 fighters. That was the whole thing. That's what started marching down from Idlib in November of 2024. And had Lebanese Hezbollah been fit for battle, had we had the Hezbollah available prior to summer of 2024, been available at that time in November, you can pretty much take it with certainty that organization would have crossed the border and probably stopped HTS somewhere around Hama.
If you look at the communications from Bashar Assad to the Russians,
yeah,
he was basically complaining that his regular staff army was more or less just running away. The only troops that actually would stick to their guns on the battlefield, it seems Hezbollah was effectively his stand and fight army.
That's absolutely
because his regular army, his uniformed army, would just run away.
Well, that's yes, indeed. I can tell you
that's what he told the Russians.
Many of us who watch Syria closely, and I probably watch Syria closer than any other regional country, with the exception of Israel, which is the one in which I live. Those of us who watch Syria closely were aware of this prior to 2024. I reported in Syria many times, and one of the times was in 2019, when the Turks crossed the border, if you remember, after President Trump appeared to have said that he was withdrawing US troops. And guys, at that time, I had the chance for the first time, actually, to spend quite a lot of time with the regime army, in the regime positions, taking a close look at the supposedly victorious government army of Bashar Assad, its equipment, its food provision, its medical provision. And this was an absolutely hollow and decrepit force, and it would have been manifestly obvious to anybody spending any time with it that was the case. So I think that if I knew it as a foreign journalist coming in, I've no doubt that the people around HTS knew it as well, and they understood that they'd been given a unique moment in which the Lebanese Hezbollah were weakened, the Iranians were busy, the Russians are busy with their endless war in Ukraine. So none of the factors that could have intervened in other circumstances and did intervene in earlier times to save Assad were available. HTS understood if it moved out of its Idlib stronghold at that time, it would be facing a very weak force. Having said that, I don't think they thought they were going to reach Damascus. I genuinely believe that if HTS had retaken Aleppo, they would have regarded that as a pretty good day's work, a pretty successful campaign. And instead, what happened was they just kept pushing forward because what was in front of them just kept falling apart, and they kept on doing it all the way down to Damascus.
In a way, it reminds me of what happened with the Bolsheviks in 1917 when they just walked into the Winter Palace because there was no one to stop them.
I think it's a really good
It's that,
comparison. Yeah, and actually I've made that comparison in a couple of articles that I've written about HTS, and I think the comparison doesn't end there also, in the sense that when the Bolsheviks took power in Moscow, they at that time still only controlled Moscow and its immediate environs. There were all these other forces on the ground. And HTS pretty much faced a similar situation. And it's been interesting to note that it still hasn't reunited the entire country under its control, but it has made significant steps towards that in the last 6 months.
does Israel have any kind of active diplomacy with the current regime in Syria, which is this weird, it's part of the surreal times we live in, that you have what I understand to be a kind of recently Al Qaeda slash ISIS type ideologically driven force
Sure.
who are what passes for the good guys in Syria, because the comparison, of course, was the brutal Assad regime, which killed hundreds of thousands of their own citizens in the civil war. Bashar Assad did. But Israel, it seems like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that they do have some common interests with the current Syrian regime. Is there any active diplomacy between those two?
There are communications, we're told. Communications have taken place, in certain locations and are ongoing. Initially, there was very, very great suspicion on the part of Israel, and that suspicion has not entirely dissipated, precisely because of the reasons that you cited, namely that, quite genuinely, this is a guy who comes from an Al-Qaeda background. Abu Muhammad al-Zawlani, Shara. This is a guy who, not decades and decades ago, but just about 10 or 15 years ago, very literally was a fighter of the late Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. That's to say, not only a militant of Al-Qaeda, but a militant of maybe the most floridly brutal and sectarian branch of Al-Qaeda that ever existed, which is, the competition would be pretty fierce for that title. And Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, I think, probably deserved it. And Abu Muhammad al-Zawlani was one of his fighters, a Syrian who went to volunteer with him. So naturally, there was a great deal of suspicion, especially in the Israeli context. Let's remember that the Israelis are just after a situation of being fooled, precisely by a Sunni jihadi who said he had moderated and become somebody regular who you could do business with. That's basically the proposition that Yahya Sinwar and the Hamas leadership made to Israel in order to lull Israel into that false sense of security prior to which made the October 7th massacres possible. So Israel looks at Abu Muhammad al-Zawlani and thinks, well, isn't this exactly the same process taking place? This time we should be extremely suspicious. So Israel is still very suspicious, and I think correctly so. I think yet more so because, of course, Shara is quite dependent on Turkish support, and Israel is increasingly suspicious of the Erdogan government or regime in Turkey and of its intentions towards Israel, the strongly Hamas-supporting Erdogan government in Turkey. So for all those reasons, Israel is very suspicious and remains so. Having said that, as you saw in Riyadh, President Trump, shook the hand of President Ahmed Shara, Abu Muhammad al-Zawlani, appeared to kind of okay his rule, agreed to the lifting of sanctions on Syria, and in so doing kind of created an atmosphere in which it then kind of would have become very difficult for Israel to have sustained a strategy of clear hostility towards Ahmed Shara without then kind of very much going against the clearly expressed wishes of the United States president, which Israel would not want to do. As a result of that, you've seen a softening in the Israeli position towards the authorities in Damascus since President Trump and Shara's visit to Riyadh. But the suspicion under the surface is still there. Israel is not, the entirety of the Israeli system, if I can put it that way, is still far from convinced, that, okay, actually, this guy does seem to be genuinely different and he genuinely wants a different way forward. Israel is still watching with a certain amount or considerable amount of suspicion, I would say.
Well, I guess the best news for Israel is that regardless of how much trust they have in this particular leader, he's got his hands full trying to unite the country, and Israel seems to have a free hand in just waltzing around and destroying weapon stockpiles.
Yeah,
which leads me to the other. I promise we'll get to Iran. Although this is an Iranian proxy group, as it's often described. The Houthis in Yemen. We were all told the world economy was going to be paralyzed because these Iranian-backed paramilitary force is the polite term, non-state actors, I suppose, although they seem to have co-opted most of Yemen's national resources, were lobbing missiles and otherwise destroying Red Sea shipping. And you have billions of dollars of oil and other commercial goods going through that area. and this was all going to be paralyzed by this group of Iranian proxies, the Houthis.
Yeah.
Have they too been taken out of the equation as a strategic factor?
Well, not really. I mean, they concluded this ceasefire with the United States, of course. But I mean, to a great extent, the Gulf of Aden Red Sea route is still not being used by international shipping because it's still quite new and ships are not quite sure exactly who's included in the ceasefire and who is not. What's happened is that global shipping, to a great extent, has just found a way around it. I mean, you have to sail a lot longer. You sail around the Cape of Good Hope, and that's how you get to Europe now rather than going up through the Gulf.
So you bypass the Suez Canal?
Exactly. You can't
don't
use
use the
Suez, you
Suez
go all the way
Canal.
down the Horn of Africa, and it takes you a few days longer and more money, and they just do what companies have generally done, which is they pass the cost on to consumers. Now, that's not great news, but what it means is that they've not managed to... The Houthis successfully shut down the Gulf of Aden Red Sea route. They did not succeed in destroying the global economy as a result of that, but it's still a very significant and real achievement. The Houthis are very much in the game still, but at the same time, three things have become apparent. One, which was obvious, is that the Houthis have no role to play in terms of ground action against Israel because they're just too far away. So they're not available for the Iranians to be a kind of ground force in the way that Lebanese Hezbollah or Hamas or paramilitary groups in Syria were available. This is firstly. Secondly, the Houthis have discovered, and others have discovered, that they're not really able to get through Israeli air defenses. I mean, they can now and then, but it's basically anecdotal. I don't want to say entirely anecdotal. Look, managing to get through and hit very close to Ben Gurion Airport is not nothing, but it's not enough to make a strategic difference to Israel. And lastly, they've found out that Israel, of course, can hit back, that they have been the subject of the attention of Israeli air power with the bombing of Sana'a airport, and now they've been the subject of Israeli naval power as well with the recent bombardment of Hodeidah port, such that the Houthis have realized, one, they can't do ground action. Secondly, they can't make that much of a dent in Israel. And thirdly, Israel can kind of make quite a hell of a dent on them. So they are not managing to be a strategic challenge to Israel. But nevertheless, I think everybody should be taking note of the fact that the Houthis have not been silenced. They did achieve something very significant with regard to Gulf of Aden Red Sea route, and they remain in power. They remain in control of the Yemeni capital and a large part of the Yemeni coastline, and the majority of the Yemeni population are living under their control right now.
Typical way Western nations would deal in the Cold War period was they'd pick another faction, send a lot of money and weapons to that faction. And has that happened? Like, is there... Well, we even hear about Israel trying to play this game in Gaza, where apparently there's baby steps towards trying to arm a rival to Hamas. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing it's sort of like local tribal strongmen who've been given a bunch of guns.
Yeah.
But has that been tried in Yemen?
Well, yeah, because I mean, if you remember, there was the Saudi and Emirati intervention.
That went on for years. That conflict.
The problem was that, if you remember, during the Biden administration, that was framed as a kind of mainly as a kind of dreadful human rights problem, which could be...
Well, the Saudis were essentially bombing the hell out of Houthi positions, right?
Yeah, so it was a dreadful human rights problem, which could be solved by forcing the Saudis and Emiratis to stop firing. Now, that is one way of looking at it, of course. I personally think that was a wrong way of looking at it, and the correct way to look at it was, that's right. The Houthis are an Iranian proxy. They've taken power in this country. What we need to do is exactly as you just put it. We've got plenty of our own proxies on the ground. Let's help them to win the war and to end Houthi control of Sana'a. This is not a human rights problem. This is a very major geostrategic problem, which we can either win or lose. The Biden people didn't look at it that way. Hence, the Houthis are still there, and the Saudis and Emiratis eventually had to pull out. I think many people felt that, what should happen with the Houthis now is we should go back to a rational policy of looking at what assets we have on the ground and supporting them against our enemy. I suspect that eventually that will take place. But right now, at least, of course, attention is elsewhere because you have a war between Israel and Iran. So things have, to some degree, dwarfed the Yemeni situation right now. But that is an option. The forces do exist. And for my money, at least, and that of many others here in Israel and elsewhere, that should be the kind of policy that Western countries should be adopting.
By the way, I said that in passing. We don't have time for a full discussion of it, but this what seems like baby steps towards Israel trying to create some kind of factional alternative to Hamas in Gaza.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, I guess I'm thinking if you're somebody in Gaza and the rumor goes around that you're effectively on the Israeli payroll. That seems like a dangerous lifestyle choice. Is there any hope for that kind of strategy in
I mean,
Gaza?
you're quite right. It was tried in the past, and what happened was that Hamas killed the people responsible. The issue now seems to be that Hamas has been sufficiently weakened and indeed has lost sufficient legitimacy among a significant section of the population of Gaza, not because they've become lovers or even likers of Israel, but because they're aware of the catastrophe that Hamas has clearly brought down in their heads, that you've got to that level. They've been sufficiently weakened that maybe this can now start to be possible. And so the Abu Shabaab thing is, a kind of pilot project. As far as I understand, the intention is not at all to sort of build his force up so that he can control the entire Gaza Strip. Rather, the idea is that this is seen to work, then Israel will start to try to develop other similar tribal. It's a proof of concept, and then you create similar organizations to handle other parts of the Gaza Strip. That, I think, is the thinking concern. They call it a cantonization.
By the way, having a dozen local warlords guarding turf against each other probably isn't the worst thing in the world.
That's the thinking. That's exactly the thinking, yeah.
So now Iran, I got to say that when this war broke out, there was an active debate on the Quillette Slack channel, despite the fact that even by the time my colleagues and I were discussing this, there had already been fairly clear Israeli successes.
Mm-hmm.
Killing some major military figures, further eroding Iran's seemingly quite unimpressive air defense system.
Yep.
I was pessimistic and remain somewhat pessimistic because uranium enrichment is a mature technology. You can kill as many scientists as you want. You can set back the logistics of it. But the main barrier to Iran producing enough bomb-grade U-235 is up to this point at least, they've gone up to the precipice, but they haven't done so. They haven't created bombs. They certainly haven't created miniaturized bombs and put them on solid fuel rockets and things that North Korea has done. And you might set the regime back a year, 2 years, 5 years in this program, but the main point of them developing a nuclear deterrent is to prevent exactly this kind of attack. So the reason I'm somewhat pessimistic about the long-term outcome of this is you say we're launching a successful military attack against you that you can't really do that much about because we have conventional military supremacy. And we're doing it to set back your nuclear weapons program. What's the only thing in the future that could prevent you from doing this at will anytime you want is to have a nuclear weapons program that has already produced a bomb.
Yeah.
So is that something that gives you pause? That in the long term, this just gives them more incentive to actually get the doomsday device that could prevent or at least dissuade this kind of attack from Israel?
Yeah, and first of all, it's perfectly possible, not even in the long term, it's perfectly possible that the current war could lead to them trying breakout, making a decision now. Okay, now it's the time in some other part of the country where they have, the sufficient material that we're not aware of, or even that we are aware of, but haven't managed to entirely destroy, to begin the process of, a rush towards that sufficient level of enriched uranium to create the, 8 or 9 nuclear bombs that the IAEA now think they're able to create within a few weeks. So yeah, it's not at all impossible that could be the case. And the logic that you describe is certainly there, which is why, my view of this is this cannot be a short one-off event. If the Islamic Republic of Iran, if the Islamist regime in Tehran is to be permitted to survive, then it needs to be under a more or less permanent threat of military action to be taken place if and when it should become apparent that it is in any way, choosing to try to go back towards enriching uranium or, breaking out towards testing a nuclear device. Yeah, so this is not really sort of a one-off thing. It has to be a somewhat ongoing process or ongoing possibility, even if Iran does come to the table and surrender. Even if Iran says, yes, something which is what, of course, we all want. Iran says, okay, we agree now to a new nuclear agreement, which involves complete dismantlement of our nuclear program and ongoing inspections of the sites concerned. Even in that case, the concerns would remain, and the concerns would remain acute. So even in that situation, what you're describing, I think, is that the logic you describe is accurate. Yeah, which is why, in my personal view, the real strategic objective has to be towards regime change in Iran, and not only stripping Iran of its nuclear capacity.
What historical precedent is there for bombing a country into regime change?
I don't think that there is, and I don't think that's certainly not what I would advocate, and that's not what I think is being done. I think if you want to do regime change, you have to support and build an Iranian opposition. It has to take place over years. It's not that I don't think anybody thinks, or if they do, then I think they're seriously deluded, that the current Israeli bombing campaign is going to miraculously produce regime change. That's not what I think. I think Western strategy...
It is discrediting the regime change.
Yeah,
it has discredited the regime.
But I think what's needed is a serious US-led strategy towards regime change, which involves creating a whole number of different components which can eventually at least weaken the regime and hopefully bring about its demise. Of course, by the way, regime change is not impossible that a major Iranian movement could begin in the wake of an unsuccessful war. I think that there are examples of regimes that lose wars and are then overthrown. An example would be the military regime in Argentina after the Malvinas War of 1982. So
Falklands War.
The Falklands War. Another example, by the way, we were talking about the Russian Revolution also. Well, the Russian Revolution also happened in first and foremost because of the return of angry and disgruntled Russian soldiers from the unsuccessful war against Germany. So military defeat and revolution actually do have a pretty respectable history of going hand in hand. But of course, you can't take that to the bank. Of course not. And I think that most responsible Israeli policymakers, although there has been ambiguity from Israeli spokesmen in recent days about the precise goals of the campaign, most of them, I think, say, we're not trying to bring about regime change. We're trying to bring about the dismantlement of the nuclear program and the destruction of the ballistic missile array, which are more, limited and maybe achievable goals. Also difficult to achieve.
Israel's not a big country, and yet it's managed to sustain an ongoing boots-on-the-ground campaign in Gaza and apparently southern Lebanon, as well as sophisticated covert operations in all the theaters we've just described, including creating some kind of drone farm in Iran, south of Tehran, which it really is like the plot of an action movie. I can't even imagine what passersby were told about what they were doing. But this just logistically, the entire population of Israel is more or less that of like a medium-sized Chinese city. How has Israel managed to deal with the logistics of all this, including like tens of thousands of people in Gaza, many of them away from their jobs? I realize that there's been force reduction since the original invasion, but still, like, that is almost more amazing to me than the actual technical accomplishments. Is the fact that this society has remained mobilized for war and different kinds of war for 2 years. Can it really sustain this?
No, it's a good question. Look, the point is, with regard to Gaza, this is something which I'm, very much aware of as somebody who lives here and was a reserve soldier myself for many years, and I'm still in touch with the unit that I used to serve with, and also in terms of, cousins and relatives of mine who are still doing reserve duty. The fact is that effort has been maintained through, a pretty superhuman effort on the part of lots of people. That's to say, I have a cousin, for example, who I was talking to today, who has just done more than 300 days in the reserve since the war broke out. So nearly a year.
But is this?
Yeah.
And sometimes these are older people, like on Miluim.
I'm talking about reserves. I'm talking about reservists. No, is this a person who is not a soldier, who has just done nearly a year of military service in frontline combat?
And sometimes these are people well into their 30s and even 40s.
He's a married man with children in his 30s. Yeah, so absolutely. So first and foremost, that's maintained through a pretty superhuman effort on the part of many Israelis. With regard to what's been achieved in Iran, of course, that involves only a very, very small number of people and is by its nature clandestine. But certainly what we can, I think, know about it or make clear is that the majority of the boots on the ground, so to speak, in Iran, carrying out the activities you're talking about, the launch of quadcopters, maybe even the targeted killings that have been taking place in Tehran and so on. These are Iranians themselves. Otherwise, there may well be here or there, I don't know, of course, and we're not going to know, as an Israeli Jewish supervisor on the ground here and there. But for the most part, those are people who have been recruited and trained by Israel, or the bosses would have been trained by Israel, and then they would have trained the other guys. And the people on the ground themselves will be Iranians who are being directed and have been trained and have been financed by an Israeli project. So that's how you get the manpower inside Iran. The manpower inside Iran is, for the most part, as far as we can gauge at least, Iranian itself.
How does Iran get penetrated so thoroughly? Like, Iran is kind of a strange country politically because we think of it as a sort of theocratic autocracy,
Yeah.
call it. It has some democratic trappings, like it goes through the motions of elections, although half the candidates get thrown out by the Guardian Council beforehand. But it seems Iranian, from a strategic point of view, Iran seems to have the worst of both worlds in that it has this sort of corruption and decrepitude that you would expect of an autocracy, but it doesn't really have um, the surveillance state capabilities to keep its population in line when it comes to this kind of drone farm. Like this drone farm wouldn't have happened in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Like that. It's just the surveillance state, at least in areas that he controlled, not in the Kurdish areas,
Yeah.
because his secret police had penetrated all layers of society. There seems to be this layer of Iranian society where the Mossad is able to recruit people and generate all this kind of intelligence and even targeted killings. It seems extraordinary.
I just think that the first thing to bear in mind with this is exactly as you hinted at, is that this is just a deeply unpopular regime. There is just lots and lots of Iranians, and especially younger Iranians, who just don't want this regime, who are Iranian patriots.
And it's the corruption. It's like more than the ideology. It's the corruption that gets them, right?
It's the corruption. But no, I think also it's the ideology. I think many younger Iranians don't want to be ruled by the Islamic Republic. They think the Islamic Republic is a bunch of old men who hold to an ideology that has nothing to do with them. So it means that this regime, at least for a very considerable section of the large Iranian population, has detached itself from any feelings of Iranian national belonging and patriotism. And most of the time, people don't want to betray their country and work for a foreign intelligence service because it hits at their basic sense of national identity and patriotism. Young Iranians have a strong sense of national identity and patriotism, but many of them clearly just don't associate that with the Islamic Republic of Iran and with the current regime. And that means that creates for you, a large pool of people with the requisite opinions and the requisite capacities who are willing to work with you. And it's clear that Israel has managed in recent years to take very great advantage of that and to do some pretty amazing things on the ground.
Okay, I think the biggest question a lot of people have in the West, and this will be my last question. I told you it was going to be half an hour. It's been a lot longer than that because I've asked you about so many different topics. United States, was this always going to be a good cop, bad cop situation, or did Trump just back end into this because, he wasn't happy with the Israeli attacks, but when they were successful, his political instincts kicked in and he wanted to kind of claim implicit credit for it. So, because the rhetoric from Trump now would suggest that this was all kind of a good cop, bad cop thing, that the Iranians walked away from 2 months of negotiations and it's like, okay, well, here's what you get. But do you find that credible, or did this just happen by happenstance?
Yeah, this is all, of course, this is speculation. I mean, in Israel, there's been pretty much a kind of wall-to-wall presentation of it as this was a kind of sophisticated deception operation in which the United States and Israel were cooperating with each other to fool the Iranians. I don't know for sure, but I tend to think that real life is usually a lot more messy than perfect deception operations, and especially without wishing. Maybe one thing we also know about President Donald Trump is that among his many great skills and capacities, keeping secrets may not be chief among them. We know that there have been occasions in the past, also to do with Israel, in the course of his first presidency, when he inadvertently, in fact, revealed very significant information that Israel certainly didn't want revealed. So I find it a bit stretching of credibility to have this notion that we're supposed to believe of this, this coordinated information operation. I'm always also cognizant of the fact that if Israel had kind of dragged him into it a little bit by just acting first of all, saying it was going to act and then going ahead and doing it, it would be in Israel's interest to then present it as a well worked out deception operation in retrospect, because that's a much more respectful way of dealing with allies than what may in fact have taken place. So the answer is I don't know, of course, and maybe we'll never exactly know, but I'm certainly not inclined to take the narrative we're being presented with, of a kind of well worked out and advanced deception operation entirely at face value.
It speaks well for the Israeli success that Trump is leaning into it. It's as they say, success has 1,000 parents, but failure always dies an orphan.
But
So there's a lot we didn't get to talk about, but I've had you on for a long time. Thank you so much, Jonathan Spire. Very much appreciate you taking time to talk to the Quillette podcast.
thanks very much, Jonathan.